Someone asked if, or somebody said, given the number of pages that I sent out, they wondered why there was so many. Let me just ask how many of you had a chance to read the material, some of the material, all the material. Oops, some, I guess everybody. And the question was asked, do I? Well, there was a reason for that, Charlie.
I just checked the list.
He's not on the list?
I've been canceled.
He's on another list. He's a separate list.
You want to read mine?
You know, I have been adding, for a while I was adding Sandra's name and yours separately, but now I think, Sandra, you're right in the thick of the list. Finally, Charlie, I apologize profusely.
Okay, I accept your apology.
Are you on it, Bill?
I'm adjusting my glasses.
Oh, you're adjusting your glasses, okay. The question's been asked whether I had a chance to read it, or whether I read it at all, anyway, as a rule. And I want you to know that I do, along with other articles that I choose not to put in there for whatever reason. And one of the reasons that I do read it is because I'm trying to understand what the heck the topic's about, so I take it pretty seriously. There were a couple of articles that I thought did a fair job of summarizing the issues on immigration. The first was the BBC article. It may not have been the first in the list. I think I led off with a government description of the immigration policies, and the BBC articles, there were actually two of them, followed a couple articles down in the text. I'm using that first BBC article, which opened something, the title of which was, "What are Biden's immigration issues?" to make it fairly straightforward. These may not be the issues that you all think are the immigration issues that are of greatest concern. And that's okay. Please, as we go through these, if you want to add some or emphasize some more than BBC did in that particular article, please do so. And the second article I'm using today is one that was distributed last October, and it was called "The 14 Myths About Immigration." I don't know how many of you were a part of the discussion a year ago. And among other things, I can't remember whether we were meeting here a year ago or over in the card room. Does anybody know?
A year ago?
Card room, I suspect, yeah.
Let's just remember you.
And we did 2 sessions, believe it or not, on immigration. So many of you weren't part of this group then, and many of the people who were part of the group then aren't here today. But anyway, that list of 14 so-called myths is something I really hope, if you didn't get a chance to read it this time, you will read it again. We'll go over them today. But in the article, in the material that was in that article, it's much better. The explanation of why the myth, or the assumption is mythical rather than factual, is better explained. So what I want to do to start is just touch on, without a heck of a lot of discussion, although we can discuss at whatever pace you want, the immigration issues today. The reason for that, over and over again, I hear people say, these are the problems of this administration. It's COVID. It's a failure to get his infrastructure through. It's Afghanistan. And consistently, and it's the border. And the crisis at the border is one of those things we've really got to deal with. What is the crisis? And among other things, it seems to me what strikes us most, and most quickly, is the velocity of immigration in these first 9 months, what is it? 9 months of the administration. And it began very quickly. The spike upward in the number of immigrants. And what is it about Biden or his policies that suddenly caused this explosion? And explosion is a big word. The high in the Trump years was 144,000. We're in August, which was the highest month. It's dipped a little bit this last month. We're at 212,000 under Biden. And these are detentions, by the way. One of the things that I'm curious to know, how many of you have, or does anyone here have an idea, the relationship between detentions and those who get through, who escape through into the country, are not detained? Is there any data on that that any of you have seen? I'm telling you, I looked high and low. It seemed to be, if we're measuring the inflow of immigrants by detentions, as a general rule, the detentions didn't make it in. What was the inflow that was able to get through the border, come across the river undetected, or come across in the trunks of cars undetected? Anybody have an idea on that? Because the measures we use are always detentions, and I would think you'd say, okay, if we detain that many, X number, the total number of immigrants in the country is going down. We had a high of around 12.2 million immigrants, unauthorized immigrants, in 2007. We'll talk about this a little later. We're down a couple million from that now, for a variety of reasons. But the detentions indicate to me that something's working. We're stopping them. The fact that there are 212,000 now instead of 144 means that many more people are trying to get in. I'm not altogether sure that's a negative. Children, which shine out because they've been kept most of the time, or until now, most recently in detention centers. And that was true under Obama, true under Trump, true under Biden. Although one of the major success stories, I think, of Biden has been to close most of those detention centers. 90% have been closed. And the children in the detention centers have been circulated around the country primarily to their families. Most of them, as you can well imagine, were sent here by a family member in another country, be it Mexico or south of there. They weren't sent here just willy-nilly. They were sent here to join an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, some extended family member. And reuniting them with that family member is the way that they were removed from the detention camps. So high velocity. No question there's a higher velocity now, and it catches our attention. What's a Title II expulsion? Simply put, it's a COVID expulsion. And Title 42 was promoted or put in place during the Trump years. It's been maintained precisely as before by Biden. A lot of the pro-immigration people are very critical of that. They're saying this automatic expulsion because of COVID is unfair to people who would otherwise be coming here for legitimate reasons. It was used, as I point out in a slide by Biden, to expel 4,000 of the recent flood of Haitians who came in. Is that the right thing to do during the COVID epidemic? You simply say, without testing or without anything else, we're just going to send you out because we don't want COVID. Of course, if you listen to some critics, they say that most of these 200,000 people detained or expelled would test positive. That also implies that we're testing all people at the border, and I don't think that's the case. Are there any comments on that? I don't know. Reunited families, the main reason we don't have as many detention centers, obviously, is that with the exception of Mexicans, and I'm not altogether sure why we accept Mexicans from this, we've been transferring the immigrant minors, as I said earlier, to families and out of the camps. 3,913 was the high under the Biden years in January. It's down to 303 now, 303 total, which is more than you'd want if one of them were your relative, but relatively speaking, it's not that number. And the reason there are 303 is you simply can't find the family members. And I guess the ultimate solution might be to send them back, although to whom? That's a tough one for me. But we hear about this a lot as one of the issues. MPP, this is a program, the Migrant Protection Protocol, promulgated under the Trump administration. And the plan was simply to say, if you want asylum, and I'll come back to the definitions of that, you must wait in Mexico for your asylum application to be evaluated and considered, as opposed to coming into this country, which was the tradition. Who here can tell me what's the difference between a refugee and an immigrant? Not all at once? An immigrant is simply somebody who was in another country who comes to this country. Don, would you raise your hand? Yeah. Good, please.
You answered that, the first half, but the other half is obviously somebody that wants to escape from some difficulty.
Refugees are a defined term. And we'll talk a little bit later about how many refugees we allow into the country. But they're defined internationally. The State Department picks up that United Nations or international agreement definition. To become a refugee, you literally have to be fleeing violence, sexual predation. You're fleeing from something bad and seeking refugee status somewhere else. Most refugees that come into this country, and there are not very many, in the last years of the Trump administration, we admitted only 15,000 from a high of over 100,000. We'll talk about that in a second. They come into this country from a refugee camp, and they've been in that refugee camp for a long time, and they are vetted 16 ways to Sunday. Refugees are not the same thing as illegal immigrants or immigrants. Immigrants are simply people from another place who migrate to this place, or back and forth. But if you're seeking asylum, what you're saying is, I am not yet a processed refugee. I've not gone through the camp. I've not been tested, vetted, and anything else. I'm showing up at the border and saying, take me, I'm seeking asylum. That's an asylum seeker. You hear all the time about how instead of people coming across the border and trying to evade the Border Patrol, they're seeking out the Border Patrol to present themselves and say, I seek asylum. And asylum seekers are exactly the same as refugees, except they haven't been processed. So they're saying, I'm fleeing violence, I'm fleeing disaster, I'm fleeing some form of danger in the place from which I've come. One of the problems with asylum seekers is, and this is an international problem, they show up in one country, but to get to that country, they've had to pass through 6 other countries. Well, if the danger they were fleeing was in the beginning country, why didn't they seek asylum in the first country they arrived in? Why did they go through that country, maybe even through another country, and through another country to come here to seek asylum?
Question.
Shoot.
Sorry,
Thank you, because we need more questions.
what I never realized until I read this material was that a person seeking asylum had to come into the country and be in the country to seek asylum. I never really understood that.
Which is one of the problems with the Migrant Protection Protocol, where they have to stay in Mexico and they can, but the only difference between what you just said and what the process is, I can go to an embassy.
Right.
Or
Until they come across the border, they are not
I can go
eligible.
to an embassy or
Right. The other thing is, like, when you read the convoluted methods by which people can come to this country, it's like a miracle anybody ever gets in. Because the rules are so ridiculous and convoluted that I can't believe what people have to go through to come to this country.
But you can also, by the way, present your credentials, your asylum claim at a consulate or embassy outside the country, have it processed there, and then enter the country having been processed. No country, to my knowledge, no country is opening the borders seeking asylum seekers. When Syrians escape Syria, or Iranians that escape Iran, or Iraqis escape, they go to the next country and they immediately flood the system, whether it's schools or healthcare or any kind of social services. No country is prepared for that or wants it. And so I can understand why asylum rules are probably pretty strict. They're probably pretty strict elsewhere, I mean everywhere, not just here. Nonetheless, there is such a thing as danger. There are such things as earthquakes, and we'll get to that when we talk about Haitians. 13,000 of the 70,000 seeking asylum are now allowed to enter, but still, that means that 57,000 can't come in to present their asylum claim. Refugee cap, and this goes back, Don, so the conversation earlier about refugees. Generally, in the world, there have to be countries that are open to refugees. Because as I said, refugees are people who go to a camp, typically, having fled violence or an earthquake or whatever. They live miserable lives in the camps. They go through arduous processes of vetting and their criminal background checks, the full 9 yards. And you'd think after all that there'd be a place to go. And the problem is countries are not allowing many refugees in. Germany excelled, as we already remember, taking in so many people from Iraq and Syria. And in Germany, the pressure to close that down was great. Hungary's, the original claim to infamy of their leader was he closed the doors, building fences to prevent refugees. And it's not, I'm not saying that to make anybody wrong. There's a natural problem. Carol, you want to say something about it? Yeah.
My understanding from having done a book review on the topic of immigration, one of the things I learned is that we were very good to refugees. And that we provided low-cost housing, we did, English classes, we teach about our culture. We do all manner of things to help them. So,
No, I don't know, I'm only familiar with Catholic Charities here, but there are 3
And
refugees
Lutheran
resettlement
services,
groups
too.
here in Jacksonville. The Lutherans are very, very strong in it. There's a non-denominational or World Health or something like that. There's the 3rd, and then Catholic Charities.
And if I'm mistaken about refugees have to apply to the United Nations.
Oh yeah, refugees, this is an international thing. They have to go through international vetting, but then once they're vetted, once we decide to let them in, it comes back to this cap. Then they're distributed around the country to these refugee resettlement agencies, of which Catholic Charities is what I know about and talk about. And look, every effort is made. If a refugee finally gets through, every effort is made to make this home. From, as Carol says, language training, but it's also a home, foodstuffs in the home, furniture. I've been a part of groups that organize furniture collections to take furniture and furnish the houses and put groceries in the refrigerators and the cupboards, and then come back weekly to restock those cupboards, because these are people who don't speak the language, don't have a job, who presumably been somewhere not very nice for a long time, and we're trying to make this as hospitable a place as we can. If every country in the world took their share of refugees, and we were trying to resettle all the refugees in the world, how many people do you think that is? Somebody have an idea what the global refugee population is? I've talked about it before, 63 million. 63 million people are in a country they don't want to be in because they had to flee the country they lived in or were born in or wanted to be in. 63 million. So if you distributed those 63 million people proportionally around the country, we'd have quite a few more than 15,000. The fact that our cap was set at 122,000, I think it was 125,000, that Obama took in, his largest year was 110,000. We can be proud of that. but it is a very small percentage of the 63 million people who are refugees. It's a real crisis in the world. And by the way, you hear about the Sahel, Carol first and then Charlie.
One of the problems at the southern border is what I understood is that there'd be a migrant line and an asylum seeker line. And once the migrants realized that the asylum line was shorter, they would jump over there because they would be allowed into the country and told to come back, for a court date, whenever, if ever. And so they get into the country that way.
Well, that's probably true, but then you go back over to the NPD, which says if you're seeking asylum, seek it in Mexico, and we'll let you in after process you there. So that device of being wanting to migrate legally and saying, well, I can't get into the long line of immigrants, so getting the asylum line wasn't working. Charlie? Either you're an equidistant, but since Sal has a new need, Phoebe's welcome back, Phoebe and Neil.
Just a couple things, Bob. Dealing with the word refugee, how do you define a refugee? Is it someone who is in danger of losing their life, being totally worked on by the people in that country in a negative way? Or is it someone who says, I think I could do better in another country, so I'm going to be a refugee? That's one question I have.
Yeah.
The other question I have is, I looked at, trying to find the Statue of Liberty, what it says, come bring us your huddled masses and so on. I'm not sure what year that was, way back when we got it from the French. But this is a different time. That was a time when this country did not have as many people. We had many opportunities for people coming in, and we were welcoming them. This is a different time, and I'm not sure that same condition exists.
Let's break it into two parts, Charlie. Both good questions. First, refugees versus, I'm sorry, there's the third.
My third comment was,
Speaking
right here, right now, here we are in Ponte Vedra, in Vickers Landing, and I don't think we personally, unless somebody does feel that same feeling about, wow, this is a real disaster. You should be giving this talk down in Del Rio, Texas, where the people coming in are affected. And that might give you another indication of whether this is good for this country to be doing.
Listen, I'd love to go to the other side of the St. Johns River, much less Del Rio. Just to get. Let's break the three down. First of all, I don't want to spend so much time on refugees. It is a defined term internationally. You cannot be a refugee seeking a better job. It won't happen. Refugees go through the most arduous vetting you can possibly imagine, and yes, they are fleeing danger. Now, the danger can be sexual predation, it can be religious persecution, but Charlie, believe me, to become a refugee is a process that's extremely difficult. It's not the same thing as wanting a better life. It's not. And I can't say that I've been to the camps and watched the vetting, but I can tell you everything I read says the number of refugees relative to those who are seeking a better life, I'm not going to say it's small. And the reason for that is because there's so many places that are not hospitable. I just mentioned the Sahel. Does anyone know what the Sahel is? Don?
It's an area between the green Africa and the sandy Africa, running the entire width of the country.
And the Sahel is moving south. And as the Sahel moves south, that means the desert part, the Sahara, is getting larger, and the green, verdant part is getting smaller. And that's a climate thing that's been going on for a long time. As the Sahel moves south, populations who were dependent upon agriculture and animal husbandry lose their livelihoods. And they're either crowding into the south or, Charlie, not refugees, seeking a better job, a better life somewhere. They are immigrants to another place, not refugees. Okay.
It's very subjective, Bob.
I take you, please do some research on it. What you find is that it's hardly subjective. There's a very clear set of standards to be a refugee. Most economic immigrants can't meet those standards. Okay? Now, am I going to tell you that no refugee has ever sneaked through on a false claim of danger? Wouldn't dream of it. Comment over here, Gene.
I think what may make it more clear is that usually someone who's seeking a better life is trying to get a permanent visa when they come into the United States, and then they work further to eventually become a citizen. I experienced this with bringing someone from Jamaica to take care of my mother. At first, I got her a temporary visa into the United States, and she could not go back to Jamaica for 4 years while I worked on getting her a permanent visa, which involved hiring a lawyer, advertising for somebody to work, taking care of my mother, who was a U.S. citizen, that she wouldn't be taking their job. It's a long, complicated process, let me tell you. She got her permanent visa and took care of my mother for many years. But it is very difficult, and that's why so many people try to come in here in other ways, because they don't have somebody like me to pay for all the fees that's involved in that. They can't do it. And that was, I knew in Jamaica, a young man who had come here to school, who had graduated, and he wanted to come back to the United States to work. He was refused. So,
Yeah, and for any of you who've done international business at all, that's a common practice. It's not the close relationship you have seeking a family retainer. But we were always dealing with foreign nationals who we wanted to employ in an international power company. We had to employ them in Houston. And the process we had to go through the same thing. We had an immigration counsel on retainer full-time for the 20 years I was in that business. It's a pain in the neck process, and I choose the word neck intentionally. What's interesting to me is that the number of unauthorized immigrants in this country, as opposed to those who've gone through this process, hit its peak in 2007 and has declined since then. That strikes me as counterintuitive. From all that I read and assimilate from the various sources of information, and you'd think, because of the difficulty of legal immigration, that the number of illegal immigrants would be, increasing vastly every year. It's just simply not. Detentions have increased, but detentions means we catch them, send them back, or detain them. They don't get through. There was a second question, and that's, was it about economic refugees as opposed to, I forget your second question, Charlie.
So,
That's what's so, I read something the other day about being in a retirement community. If you have nothing to do all day, it's difficult to know when you've finished. But the other thing about it is we all forget what our last
I just have a little problem with this refugee definition and how many of these people who get through are exactly. I don't know where you're getting your numbers from, and I don't know how accurate they are because I see a lot of numbers. Refugees, I do know a little bit about that because my family, I had a number of them coming over from Europe when there was a real problem with their livelihood and their lives. So it's, I don't know if we still have that problem today, where people are coming from. I can understand people wanting to come here to have a better life. That's understandable. But, is that our responsibility?
The current issue is Afghanistan, that they would be refugees.
What category?
It's interesting to look at the history of the United States attitude toward refugees and or immigrants. Every one of us presumably is an immigrant from somewhere or in our lineage. We've not had a policy to make us proud during many eras. We did not accept a ton of Jewish refugees from Europe in the early years of the 40s. In fact, it was a shameful policy. Ships bouncing along the coast, trying to find a place where they could dock and allow refugees to get off the boat. Carolee?
I just wanted to know if you know what category do the Afghan people that we accepted here fall into? Are they refugees?
No,
Or are they immigrants?
They're all refugees, but what I don't know, and this is something the research understands more about, is whether or not they had to go through the kind of vetting that, I know that we talked a lot about the refugees that were pulled out in those last few days, and a lot of critics of the plane loads coming out. Essentially, we said, what a disaster that we're leaving people behind, but how are we allowing these people to come into our country that haven't been properly vetted? They're clearly not going through refugee camp and camp vetting. They stopped at Oman, many of them, where there was a brief period of vetting, or in Germany, there was a camp with a brief period of vetting. I don't know whether they went through the same process as the International Refugee Committee pushed them through. And I don't know either how many we actually took into the United States. Does anyone know here? Is it the tens of thousands? I can't remember. But I don't think so. I think that's not going to be another happy chapter in our history of refugees. I want to go through just the refugee camp again. I've talked about that. Remain in Mexico, reunited families. Oh, I'm going backwards.
You're at the bottom, the wall.
I got it. Is this correct?
Yeah. We did that, didn't we?
Well, there are 44 million immigrants in the country out of a population of 350 million. And that means that many of us who are second, third, and fourth generation are no longer considered immigrants. But then the illegals, this point I was mentioning earlier, it was a high of 12.2 and of 7, came down to 10.5. It's crept back up, but only by a couple 100,000 in the years since then. If the illegal population is at a point of decline or moderation, what's all the fuss about? There was the article, it was called 14 Myths About Immigration. It was one of the pieces I circulated, and I know many of you read it carefully and will be able to expound on these points. But it's just interesting to go through it again, because they are myths that are part of our culture for a natural reason. We think these things. And I think there are others that we just think because it's what you assume. The first one is that immigrants take American jobs, lower our wages, and especially at the bottom end of the wage scale. How many of you have seen employees needed signs on the back of trucks recently, or in kitchens? Throughout this country today, we are faced with a shortage of workers. Now,
Getting paid not to work.
and that's probably because primarily these are scofflaws who are being paid a fortune to stay home. But didn't that stop September 1st?
Yes.
So this fortune they've been, I'm sorry?
In some states.
In some states.
Yeah.
Are we still paying them to stay home here in Florida?
No.
Then why can't we find workers here in Florida? Did we pay them so much and they saved so carefully that they're able to live on their savings from their payments?
No.
I mean, Charlie, it makes all the sense in the world to say, if we're paying them to stay home, of course they will. But when the payment stopped 6 weeks ago, the argument starts to fade in my eyes, and I'm still seeing the signs saying, help wanted. And as a rule, those signs come up when population declines or stays even. If you look at why economies grow, why countries prosper, the material that you can read about that says the number one reason countries prosper is population. Either their birth rate is high or they take in immigrants. The only two ways you can grow your population. And the more people you have, as a general rule, now you can say that as long as those people aren't being paid money to stay home, but as a general rule, the more people you have, the stronger your economy is. It takes 2.1 people, 2.1 children per couple for the population to grow by birth rate.
Well, I never considered that first item to be a myth. I mean, legal, if you think of legal immigration, the basis for legal immigration is they have certain educational qualifications, certain things that will benefit the country. That's part of our legal immigration criteria. So I don't see where it would hurt American jobs. It helps the country with their expertise. That's
Sure.
That's part of
And as you think at the bottom of the scale, not the highly educated. The highly educated makes a lot of sense, but at the bottom of the scale, we need more dishwashers. And I don't care what the education is, we need more lawn cutters. And that's the bottom of the scale that pushes everything up. Jenny?
I just will use as an example, again, the gal that I got the permanent visa. When I advertised for anybody who would come to take care of my mother, and they told me what newspapers I had to advertise in, nobody answered my ads. No one for the job that I was going to be giving Millie, is her name. When Millie got her permanent visa, and I said she stayed and took care of my mother until my mother died, what did Millie do? She went to school, graduated first as a nurse's aide in the class that she took, and went to a nursing home and would work 2 shifts all the time, sending money back to Jamaica to help her family in Jamaica. But she was not doing any of these things. She was not using the welfare. She was a hardworking gal and a very good citizen here.
One of the things that's interesting about this whole immigration policy, and I think I talked about this, Don, last fall. Imagine how difficult it is to migrate from your home, to leave your home and family and friends and familiars and go to another place, whether that other place is the neighboring state or a neighboring country. It's not something you just pick up and do. It's hard to do. Our ancestors did something really hard. And they weren't the majority in their countries. I don't know about Ireland. They may have sent more people over than stayed, but I don't think so. I think as a general rule, that decision to migrate to another place is still a tough decision and not one easily made. Charlie?
It's very clear the direction that what you believe and where you're going since you started this whole thing today. Can you give us some thoughts on the other side, why it's not such a good idea to do this?
To accept more?
Yeah, take the other position, Bob.
Yeah. I mean, I can legitimately do that, but I have some answers for it, but I think it's a real problem. We have very tight school budgets right now. We are short of classroom facilities, teachers, books, you pick it. How are we going to handle an immigration wave that comes into our school systems? I'm talking to places like Ponte Vedra. We're not well equipped for a lot more people. And whether it takes, on a general basis, puts pressure on our systems on a local level, I can't imagine it doesn't. Does that make sense? And if it puts pressure on our systems, it means, among other things, either we pay more in taxes, or our children, our legitimate people, have a worse education, or worse welfare. I mean, there are reasons to try to limit population growth.
But there are places in Idaho where we just came from, very small towns, that are dying to have people come. They don't have enough people in their
Yeah, the biggest argument I have against taking the other side, I'm trying to take Charlie's side of that thing. If I were a populous, wonderful place to live.
We need immigrants.
Yeah, but in eastern Colorado, along the Nebraska border, in Idaho, in all the rural areas, desperate for people. And they've got empty classrooms because all the people left to go to the better places. And that's a real problem. They don't have doctors, they don't have lawyers, they don't have the kind of infrastructure needed to support people. So I live in a vast number of the United States, and my argument against immigrants pales. But that's an argument I make. Immigrants, these are the myths, and I won't read them too much, but I refer you to that article, The 14 Myths of Immigration. Illegal immigrants don't get welfare as a rule. They don't want to expose themselves to deportation, so they avoid the official system. And anything that's official exposes them to that risk. And thus they don't increase the budget deficit. We talk all the time about these people not paying taxes and getting the benefits. In many instances, taxes are withheld, but they can't collect the benefits because of their status. These myths, go through that article. I'm not going to do it all here for you. Let's just have a more open discussion. It may sound like it has been alleged that I'm a biased moderator. Let me be very clear. I'm not a neutral leader of this group. I've made it very clear that I have certain positions, and I try to share information about those positions. Am I pro-immigrant? I'm pro-growth, for sure. And if that growth depends upon more immigration, put me down as pro-immigrant. Do I think we should vet the dickens out of them? Yes. Can we vet them if they come in as economic immigrants? They're not here because they're refugees, they're not seeking asylum, they want a better job. Well, if we've got jobs unfilled and they want a better job, I say, welcome to work. Here's your W-2 application. Is that wrong? I mean, how many of you think that's a misguided bias? Jean?
I lived in...
Sal, you have the mic.
I was engrossed in what you were saying. Or going to say. I lived in Austin, Texas for a long time, and I saw a lot of building going on. And who was up on the hot roofs in 104-degree temperatures? Mexicans. Immigrants. Who was doing all the dirty work? Immigrants. And at one stage, there had been so much bad publicity about immigrants in Texas, in this environment, that they decided that for 2 days they wouldn't work. And all of my friends were going around saying, where are they? I mean, why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? And it was estimated that my house probably cost $50,000 less because they had a source of very, very inexpensive labor doing these horrible jobs.
How many of you have go to Gate from time to time, or Shell, where they've been at convenience marts? Have you been there at 7:30 or 8 in the morning? Yeah. It's just filled with Mexicans, primarily, or not for Mexicans, Latins. And they're getting their big packs, and if you go at 5 in the afternoon, they're getting their 6-packs. I think it's true here as well as it is in Austin, but I don't think they're illegal, but I don't know. I don't think they're anxious to have ICE show up at the workplace. Are they a source of terrorism, drugs, or COVID? Those are 3 things if you listen to some sources that'll say that's what's wrong with immigration. You want to hear my bias view?
You're always
Josh, hey, Carol,
I have some statistics from the Cato Institute about
just a second.
I have some statistics from the Cato Institute about this issue of crime. It said the down found that the incarceration rate for illegal immigrants was 756 per 1,000. This is substantially higher than the 364 rate for legal immigrants, but substantially lower than the 1,471 for Native Americans.
And that source, by the way, Cato, is not a screeny liberal source. But it's true. I mean, the fact is, legal immigrants are probably more law-abiding, illegal immigrants are arrested. I don't think it's 756 per 1,000, or we wouldn't get our lungs moving. It's 756 per 100,000. But nonetheless, the rate of incarceration is higher for Native Americans. The rate of drug use is higher for Native Americans. Guns go south. Drugs come north. Drugs come north through ports of entry. 90% of the time, or even in the mail, it's fentanyl. The idea that drugs are coming across the border by these drug deals walking across the Rio Grande is just another part of the myth of migration. Terrorism. How many Middle Eastern terrorists are coming across the border with these Mexicans? Well, what we do know is we're able to detain 90% of those, I don't know if it's 9 or 99. Our detentions are very high. How many of those detentions are known terrorists or potential terrorists? The short answer is anyone that we think is a known or potential terrorist, we don't send them back, we arrest them. We're not arresting them. The data just isn't there that says terrorists are part of that onslaught at the border. Okay. So drugs, terrorism, and COVID, as I said earlier, this Title 42 thing, which was promulgated under Trump and maintained under Biden, we send back most people because we just don't, we have a right to do so because of the fear of COVID. Another interesting myth, it's easy to immigrate to the United States, as Jenny says, try hiring one legally. It's just hard as heck. It's worth it, but it's hard. This is an interesting one among those myths. If you spend much time in Texas, and I don't know if you felt this way when you lived in Austin, Jeannie, you hear all the time the big risk of immigration is that they're all Democrats, and they're going to vote Democratic, and that's why Democrats want to bring them in so that they get the electoral edge. And being of a certain persuasion, I wish that were so. I think immigrants elected our current governor. And it was a misapprehension on the part of many Democrats that all the immigrants in Florida would vote Democratic. They didn't. Just full stop, they didn't. Whether they're from Cuba, we said, well, no, Cuba's a good Republican. But the people in Orlando who are not just Cuban, they're Mexican and elsewhere in Latin America are going to vote Democratic. They didn't. In Texas, if they were really all voting Democratic, it'd be at least a purple state. It's not. Bill?
Is this legal immigration or illegal
immigrants aren't voting. So don't worry too much about that.
It's what?
Illegal immigrants aren't voting.
He's talking about legal immigration.
This is legal
Legal
immigrants, yeah.
Well, yeah, and we agree with that.
Do you think that they will vote Democratic? No, I'm saying that is the myth. But here in Florida, they're not voting. They're voting Republican.
Well, immigrants, no. Immigrants will not vote Democratic.
Yeah. Although at one point we all thought they would.
Yeah, I agree, but this is legal immigration.
Yeah.
Okay. Myth. Yes, okay.
These are myths.
Immigrants bring in their bad culture. If you go to 7-Elevens and you see these my screen just changed, and you see these different nationalities, are they culturally diminishing our community? That's not my experience. And again, I hate to be biased on this thing, but I can only share my experience. Now, Charlie's question whether I hate it. Any comments, questions, suggestions? Nancy, we get a mic back here, Phoebe or Sal.
Who defines bad? What is bad? What does that
Bad, opposite good.
That's opposite good. Well, I know what it is. I don't know who can define it. Who's defining it? I mean, that isn't, what I might think is
Oh, bad culture.
bad, you might not, or whatever. Bad culture.
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms that's been raised, and again, I think it's in depth, is that the different cultures that are represented by immigrant populations, different from ours. Let's say it's an Muslim community in Detroit.
You're talking religion.
Well, the whole culture of how they pray, work, and live. Is that bad? I wouldn't say so. I would say it's different. And in some respects, it's significantly better than other cultures.
We all seem to flock to Mexican restaurants.
There is that. Or Chinese.
Or Chinese.
I think people have to go back and look at what it takes to become an immigrant here, because it's so convoluted and difficult that you will all be amazed. But I have the facts about the Afghans, if you want those.
Yeah.
They have agreed, the United States has agreed to take in 37,000 Afghans after they come from Afghanistan. And there is somebody who's been appointed, a former Delaware governor, has been appointed to oversee the resettlement. 46 states have agreed to take in the Afghan refugees. And in conversations with nearly every state, not one official declined to take Afghans. This is a report from Axios on September 21st.
Think about that for a second. 37,000 coming in.
Are coming in total.
Just listen to that number in the abstract, seems like a lot of people. Separate or divided into 46 states, it's 600 or 700 people per state.
Right, they have it broken down by states.
Lost in the airport.
California is projected to receive the largest number at 5,025. Texas is taking in 4,448. And then Hawaii, South Dakota, West Virginia, and Wyoming are the only states not slated to receive anyone from the first group of evacuees, along with Washington, D.C. Just surprising, Hawaii not accepting anybody. All the other states are accepting the Afghans.
But again, they're accepting them, and it's not a big burden.
No.
I think California's taking 5,000, or Texas 4,000.
5,000.
It's just not a big burden.
Right. It's interesting.
How many of you would, Phoebe?
All these Afghans coming from Afghanistan were people that helped the United States for years, and they know who they are. So they weren't just people that lined up.
That's our fervent hope.
I mean, that quick evacuation was people that have been helping the United States.
I think a legitimate concern is that the chaos at the airport, there are probably some people who didn't help us very much who got served. Do I think a lot of them? I don't. And I think that they could be identified in either the Oman camp or the German airfield, probably. I don't know. To me, it's not it's not a big threat. We're about out of time. Oops, Carol.
The only thing that bothers me about Sharia law is that it's also not only their religion, it's their government. They don't have separation of church and state.
Well, that's certainly true. And, I find it interesting that we allow, not allow, we encourage the relationship we have with the Saudis, whose application of Sharia law is as old as the hills. And the Wahhabis there are just as conservative as the Taliban in Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan, the presence of the Sharia state is so bad. We adopted all of our contracts. I don't know whether Bill, you had any work with Islamic communities, your trucking company on Doug's not here today. Have any of you had Islamic communities in your employments and your careers? We had to conform our contracts to Sharia law in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Egypt. And conforming did not change the way we operated our plants. We didn't. To me, this whole issue is in the international business thing, it was kind of a non-event. It was a minor hassle with no real change in what we actually did. In other words, we didn't have to cut the hands off lazy employees. Any other comments?
I'd just like to say that I certainly hope some of these Afghans could work in our kitchen. Because we really need someone in our kitchen. And I think that would be most helpful, whether they're Haitians or Afghans, bring them on, because they're having a terrible time at Vickers hiring people.
Anybody here with have a problem with spicy food? Be aware. Ken?
Yes, good.
Ken, Mark up here. Thank you, Kurt.
Well, just getting back to the very first point about the increase in detentions.
Yeah.
We do, I don't think it's anecdotal that the Border Patrol people are spending a lot of their time doing things that normally they wouldn't be doing, the paperwork, etc. As a result, what we don't know is how many people may be coming in that that getting through. I mean, we just don't know that. And who are they? And, well, maybe there's not a lot of them, so it doesn't make a difference. We also know that ICE is not doing the same job now that they used to do. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But
In terms
so
of
things have changed. They're not going after people, looking for people as much as they did previously. That's a change that Biden made. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just pointing it out. So things have changed, and it's sometimes perception is there's a perception that things are not going right. I mean, that's the sense you get.
and it'd be interesting to talk about how we develop our perceptions. Charlie, I want to come back to your questions. Charlie first.
What about the wall? The wall that is a discontinued building, but on the other hand, has not been torn down. So what's your thoughts on how that affects what's going on?
It's related to Ken's comment, and one of the things I had difficulty finding, and I looked, and I used multiple search things in Google. What if we're detaining 290,000? Who are we not detaining? Is that 5% of the 290? Is it 20%? Is it 1%? I don't know. And that's your question, really, Ken. Who's getting through? And I can't find that. If anybody has an idea have they developed a good guess as to who gets through? If you're catching 10, does that mean you're missing 1 or 2? Or I can't find that data. And I don't know whether that's because there are not so many that we care about it, or that they don't know and don't want to guess. So my answer is I don't like the idea that anybody's coming across that we don't know about. Full stop. We ought to know about everybody that's coming in. And if we don't know about it, we don't know whether they're terrorists, whether they've got COVID, whether they're in any way, shape, or form a threat to our country. If we don't know about it, we don't know. And maybe this is one of those things, there are things we know that we don't know, and then there are things we don't know that we don't know. I don't know. So that's a big question to me, but it goes back to the issue that you raised then. Charlie, I'm trying to think what it was. What did you just mention?
The wall.
The wall. We don't know who's getting through. We do know who we detain. And we know that from the data. If in the absence of a completed wall, are there hundreds of thousands of people coming north? Tens of thousands? Thousands? Coming north through the gaps in the wall? And if there were a wall, would that really prevent all those people? Presumably it would. But my answer to that is I don't know. On the basis of what I don't know, I'm going to tell you, I don't like a wall. I still believe build bridges, don't build walls is a better policy. On the other hand, boy, a wall would give us knowledge about who's coming in, who's not. Now, does the wall have to be a physical wall? Can it be an electronic wall? Or is that part of the reason we're detaining more people than we used to? We see them coming across the country. Is the wall the best use of funds? Or would it be a better use of funds to resettle more effectively and more completely? Again, I don't know the answer. How many of you here would support going back to the construction of the wall? Interestingly enough, that's not even full half. How many of you would not build the wall if... Yeah, I mean, we're pretty evenly divided. I think probably a slight in this room, a slight majority would not build the wall. Jen, do you want to comment on that?
Yes.
A lot are not answering. A lot of hands stayed still.
No.
Don't be intimidated.
No, I think of the wall or not the wall in a different way. I really feel sorry for the people who have to work as guards on that wall. If there's one job I would never want to have, or I wouldn't want my husband to have, or my son to have, would to be one of those guards. It must be a horrible situation to be in. So therefore, I always think, okay, what kind of people would that attract? It would attract the bullies, the people who get pleasure out of being able to pick on someone weaker. That's my thoughts. So would the wall help us in that we could have a much better situation for the border guards?
Again, I don't know. Joan, first, and then Don. Phoebe, could you give Joan the mic? Thanks.
I wonder whether the wall increases prejudice, whether they see the wall, people see the wall, and they say, oh, they're bad people over there. That's why we have the wall. And that's why I don't like the wall.
Don, really?
I don't think there is a wall.
You know, the history of walls is not very good. The Chinese built one to keep the Mongols out. The Mongols came in anyway. It took them 100 years to build it. And the Romans built a Hadrian Wall in North England in the back time of Caesar to keep the Picts out. The Picts came in anyway. And so, and of course, we have the Berlin Wall, which is now nothing more than a tourist attraction. Yes, I would think that building that wall would have some effect, but the cost of it is enormous. Certainly physical. And so what are we gaining? Because that's, this immigration problem is not the problem. The problem is not immigration, it's the problem from why are these people coming? What's happening back in their countries that are forcing them, as did our ancestors, to come to a better place? And until that situation is addressed and somehow dealt with, the walls, you can build walls around. The Indians should have built a wall down about 500 years ago down the East Coast and kept all us out.
They should have.
The two walls, one just inside the coastal states on both sides of the country.
Well, I'm not sure I should be talking about this, but I grew up in the South Bronx, and in the late 40s and very early 50s, the migration, I don't know what you call it, from Puerto Rico was extensive.
Okay.
Now, what it did was it changed the Bronx. Some people may think it's the same as the old Bronx, but it's changed. And it's not really as bad as I think as people make it out. There's a lot of things that go on, it's true, and there's a lot of poor in it. But there was also a time when they said Irish keep out. So I have no bias about it. I lived with it. And I played baseball on a team. I was the only Caucasian on the team. And that's the way I grew up.
And that's why I lost.
Well, we all did, that's the problem.
No, I mean, going back to, I think the attitude toward immigration, there's a whole lot to speak for there. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Neil.
This is not a trick question, but how many people in this room have either parents or grandparents who are immigrants? Everybody raise your hand.
Everybody, everybody, unless you're a Native American.
Maybe great grandparents are very great, but sure. I see no Native Americans here.
No. Be a
Um,
Native American.
But there is this a strong theory that pull the ladder up after you get there, right? It works in a lot of different ways. That, by the way, is a joke. It's a pastime. Oh no, Nancy.
We haven't mentioned public education. There's been a lot of discussion about it. But for different cultures coming in, public education is going to have to accommodate them because there will be problems, issues in public education.
Thank God that's primarily an issue for Democrats because most Republicans will be either in charter school or homeschools, which is another.
You think?
Okay, we're going to end today with this. So, Don, always good.
I hope we are going to end today, but I have a suggestion. I agree with Charlie that you are leaning slightly to the progressives. That's fine. That's my position too. But please don't send us out 4 hours worth of reading in preparation for this. If you could, since you do read it yourself, could you separate it and give us the pros, the cons, and then we can take it from there in here. But there's so much right now, it's overwhelming to me, and I'm not completely
And
stupid.
it's obvious that most people didn't.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions like that. Point taken, and I will, but this time, just by the way, I sent things that I sent, it already sent out last year, and I probably should have said, only read something else. Quick future. Gary Chartrand is going to speak to us about education, Nancy, on November 5th. One of the things that I want to do is explore the content that is implied or being discussed for pre-K and early school education. Several of you have mentioned concerns about not so much federal support for pre-K and young children education, but rather what are the implications content-wise for that federal role? Trying to suss that down without having a deluge of information. Can you deluge somebody or delude them at the deluge? Maybe I'll try to, if somebody has some ideas about how to research, what's the content of pre-K? What's the content in our child care centers? Are they just teaching these kids not to hit each other? I mean, what's going on? Nancy?
I'm chairman of the North Florida Pre-K State Facility and a volunteer position. I'm not a salary person. And I thought I would ask the person that is salaried to come in and speak to you, so to explain what the pre-K program is.
Oh, I love that.
Because, it was started by Bush. That's when I started. Bush put me in place there. And it was started by Bush, and it's been going on through the rest of the governors each year for each.
Oh, I think that would be wonderful. And if possible, he or she could come before the 5th of November. We've got 2 or 3 meetings. I love that. And that gives some content there. I'd like to also get some idea for what, if we can research it, what the federal, somebody in that $3.5 trillion package advocacy group, somebody there must be thinking about content for the pre-K education program.
The state is funding Florida.
I'm sorry?
The state of Florida is being funded, pre-K is funded by the state of Florida.
Is it universally available in Florida, pre-K?
Yes.
But no cost?
Now, you have to understand, there's many, I'm just in North Florida, which I have, what, 7 counties, I guess. Well, there are many areas in Florida which have different problems for pre-K. And so it's all over the state in different areas with different issues.
I'll talk to your person, that'd be very good. And if anybody has other ideas about how we can beef up our conversation of education, let me know by email.
Bob, please explain who Gary Chartrand is for those.
For those who don't know, Gary was appointed by Rick Scott, I think, first, as head of the Florida Board of Education. Served an 8-year term, 8-year term on the board, 2 years as chairman of the board. And that qualifies him to talk a little bit about Florida education. He is the chairman, now non-executive chairman of Acosta, which is a food product roll-up that's one of the largest companies in the area. In my discussions with him, he is a pro-public school, anti-union, and he says to the extent that the unions dominate the public schools, he would just as soon not have public schools. He'd prefer people go to charter and other, take advantage of other options. But we'll hear more. He's a very bright, very capable guy, and I think his position as chairman of the board, state board, is going to be useful. And we'll try any ideas on who we can ask to help us with this whole thing. Content and quality, are those things being discussed? They must be. We're not just going to have random individuals show up and take care of our kids. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.